Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's December 6th, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me Professor Thomas or Tom Harrington. He is the author of the Treason of the Experts, and it's a fabulous book. He writes fluidly, elegantly, and with wisdom. So that's a rarity in and of itself. It's a compilation of essays through brownstone.org. Tell us, Tom, about yourself and about what is the Treason of the Experts.
By trade, I guess you'd have to say I'm a Hispanic studies expert. I spent 25 years at Trinity College and a few before that at Lafayette College. My area of expertise in the academic world was the study of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and especially within that, it was the matter of national identity movements, how they're formed and how intellectuals play a role in creating the realities that we eventually call nations. So what may seem far-fetched isn't really far-fetched, because in order to do that sort of work, I had to become involved with cultural mobilization and how ideas are formed and how elites form ideas for us that we often take for natural ideas. And I was very influenced in this realm by my mentor. He's a wonderful person and a wonderful scholar, Itamar Eben-Zohar. He's from Israel. And he's the founder of a theory that's called polysystems theory, in which you look at the traffic of texts and ideas and how they are organized in society to create the environment around us that causes quote unquote reality. And so it's a way of thinking that once you begin doing it, changes the way you look at the world. In my particular case, I always go back to one particular moment when I was doing my archival research, and I saw an interchange between an intellectual from Portugal and one from Galicia, the northwestern part of Spain, talking about how this particular trope or this particular element of national identity from Portugal was going to be used in the Galician national identity movement. And so we could pinpoint the moment when this was borrowed from one intellectual to another. And yet if you went out in the street in Galicia, which I often did, and you used this term, which happened to be saudade, and you ask them where did it come from, he says, well, people have always thought in terms of saudade here in Galicia. We've all this, it comes from the earth, it comes from our spirit, it comes from other places. And I said, well, not really, if you know the archival path. And so that was a real brain opener for me. And it made me get more interested in how elites generate, invent, and then spread national identity ideas, which then I began to apply to the whole world of politics and the creation of reality in our media-saturated age. So when COVID came along, I looked at this, and after you think along these lines for several decades, you begin, at least I'd like to think, picking up an ability to see what is being manufactured and what is not. What is actually coming tectonically out of the population, and what is being imposed upon them. And to me, it was immediate that this was an elite manufactured hysteria and an elite manufactured consensus management machine working at this. And I just couldn't not see the reality after that. So I became very interested in it and began analyzing it as a cultural problem.
Well, so there's a lot to parse there, but I'm going to stick with the last point that you saw it, you couldn't unsee it, and unlike many, you did something about it. You know, after 9/11, there was like, if you see something, say something. I think people saw something. You know, Groucho Marx said, "What are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" I think if we transmute that to, or transmit that to, say Dr. Fauci as the embodiment of Groucho Marx, or Marxian ethics in this case. We were supposed to believe him and not our own lying eyes for a lot of this. Yeah. But you followed your own muse in this regard. Given some of the kind of siloed nature of elites, and we'll get to some of that, their own world and their own worldview. how were you able to divorce yourself enough that you could say something about this, and or how did your viewpoints differ from those in your class?
There are really two elements to that. There's the intellectual problem, and then there's the personal one. How do you stand up to these people who you thought were your friends and allies and make a stand? But the intellectual problem is one that brings to mind a wonderful book by Ralph Nader's sister, Laura Nader, who is a very accomplished anthropologist out at Berkeley. I think she's retired now. And she has a book called Controlling Practices. And she looks at the way societies create practices that put people on the defensive in terms of going outside of certain lines. And she does it in a comparative fashion, going from Mexico to a number of places around the world, and shows how these implied controlling practices work. Chomsky's got a similar idea, which is the field of thinkable thought, that you must stay always within the field of thinkable thought. So as someone who is always looking and was studying how consensus are created, you inevitably begin to get into the question of what stays in the field of thinkable thought and what is outside the field of thinkable thought. In the book, there's an essay in which I talk about culture. And of course, culture comes from the agricultural world, right? We cultivate things. And what really is culture? It is human beings taking husbandry of the land and making value judgments about what you find on the land. In other words, weeds are bad, carrots are good. Well, in culture, we do the same thing. It's called canonization in the field of literature, right? You decide what the canon of acceptable or good works are, and which ones are worth holding on to, and which ones in turn are considered disposable and not worth handing on to the next generation. So those, I was very well versed in the dynamics of controlling practices or preserving the parameters of thinkable thought, or if you want to put it literarily, canonization. So I could see that there was a heavy duty canonization effort coming down from on high from the very beginning. But that doesn't absolve me from the second question, which is the human one. How do I tell people that I trust my view of cultural dynamics and the heavy-handed canon making that's going on, and how do I stand up in the face of their personal pressures upon me? And I have a much less clear answer to that, except to say that over time, and I think probably you would agree, as we get older and we see a lot of the flimsiness of what passes for great truth in a given moment, and we see how the people that were lionized in 7th grade by 9th grade are, a very different person and less lionized. I think if you observe carefully, you see how those processes are much more ephemeral than they seem in the moment when all the pressure is being piled on you. And I think it's through the experience of being able to say, hey, I've called things out early, the hype goes away, and what remains is what seems to have been apparent to my lying eyes, to go back to your wonderful reference.
Yeah, well, the pun is running through my head about lionizing people who are talking through their lion eyes.
Yeah.
The jokes write themselves here.
Yeah.
So I kind of, there's so many wonderful essays to go through amongst those in the book, The Treason of the Experts. But for cultural reference, before we do that, I want to say I'm perhaps the only person on earth to have all three of these books. There's the derivation of your title. I kind of have to get out of the way. It's kind of foggy. I don't know, kind of funny. It's the La Treason declare, Julien Banda. And this is the French version. And this is from, I think, the early
26.
Okay, fair enough.
27.
And I actually have the very, very rare version of the one in English, which you can't see because it blurs out, Treason of the Intellectuals. So that is not our censors that are blurring that book. But perhaps you could talk about the derivation of your Treason of the Experts and the relationship to these to the earlier term. And of course, I'd like you to focus, and you do this spontaneously, but on the translation La Treason des clercs to the treason of the intellectuals. Clerk we think of as obviously somebody at the record store as a clerk, if there is such a thing as a record store anymore. But they're talking about the clerisy, the religious clerk, and the way that I guess intellectuals have taken over that mantle. But perhaps you could speak to the original book, how it was received, what it was referring to, and then we can go into some of your other references about World War I and whatnot.
Wonderful. The book itself, Treason des clercs, is, as I mentioned earlier, either from 26 or 27. And it was written by the French intellectual Julien Banda, who was someone who, after the horrendous bloodletting of World War I, and I don't think everyone in newer generations realizes how epically significant World War I was in terms of upping the ante on human destruction. But it really was. And if you look back at it, it came out of basically absurd or relatively absurd reasons that had to do with people trying to create new borders in a Europe that had just lost 3 of its important empires. But what Banda does in the book, and maybe there's another element that needs to be highlighted. One of the things that when you study, as I did intensely, the period between 1870 and let's say 1930, which it's the period where in Europe and in much of the Western world, intellectuals began to replace the church as the thought leaders of many societies. In other words, it's the great period of secularization, it's the great period of urbanization, it's the great period of the creation of the working class, and it's also the great period of secularization. And in this new secular world, the mantle that was previously held by the clerisy or the priesthood or the ministry, depending on what the religion was in the particular country, was filled rather quickly by the writer. In other words, the writer, there's one other factor, which is the inventing of daily newspapers and the printing press. So writers now could make a living. Independent people could become pundits, of what we would call today. And all of these factors in the late 19th century and early 20th century created a revolution in the clerisy of the society. It became a secular one. But the desire, I argue, in one of my other books, for this clerisy to be our commanding voice comes out of the fact that people have a religious yearning. And that nationalism fulfilled, even as we became secular and said we no longer need the transcendence of God, we used that energy that we used to devote to the transcendent God to make the nation the receptacle of our transcendence. And so all those factors together created a new dynamic in which you had intellectuals teaching the masses about how to think about the world. And Benda, after seeing where that got people and the tremendous nationalist-inspired destruction of World War I, he said, this is all wrong. An intellectual needs to be a seeker of truth above all. And when he begins to use his position to become another jingoist, he is, in fact, being treasonous to his role as a true cleric, which he sees is an impartial, to the greatest extent possible, seeker of truth. And so what he's doing in this book, he's saying, where were you, French intellectuals? Where were you, German intellectuals? What happened to you? Why did you cheapen yourself? Why did you come down from where you need to be in terms of looking at things in their most stark light and become cheerleaders for these awful projects that cause so much death and destruction? And for me, as a student of nationalism, this is a very powerful book because on one level, it reaffirms the idea of elites in creating social realities, but it raises moral questions about what their role is or should be in the society. And he's clearly coming down on the side that they shouldn't be people that just simply add to the frenzy of nationalism and what the rabble, so to speak, wants to do or is being encouraged to do by the most cynical people in the society, the ones who are at the higher level above the clerisy, who are calling the shots. And for me, that was just a natural fit. If that's not what we saw a massive selling out of people of, if you'll let me say it, our class, who've been lucky enough to have spent many years in school. And we should have been asking bigger questions, tougher questions, and we didn't. And we became cheerleaders for a pressure campaign designed on high, and we became willing members of the clerisy. And you bring up the etymological problems with the translation of clair from French. There's a lot of different words that are derived from the similar Latin root. There's clerk, as you point out, which puts a sort of more banal look at it, but you can think of clerk, you can think of a member of a bureaucracy. But then you can think of clerisy or cleric, which imbues it with a religious feeling, and that would be more like the professor or the intellectual or the writer. And then I always get it confused with the Catalan, traición. The treason, of course, is another word that we kind of play with in English. We think of he's treasonous, well, he's going against something, but it literally means betrayal. And there's a betrayal. The traición is betrayal, in traición in all of the Latin languages. So it's a betrayal. They didn't do their jobs. And I'm calling out my own class in doing so, I guess.
So there are oaths, getting back to the clerisy, and we'll come to doctors. You know, we physicians, you can tell I'm a physician because it's got the MD right there. We have a Hippocratic oath. I mean, mind you, that's changing a lot. It's got its own story. People are basically watering that down. I know, fortunately, you're sitting down, so you won't faint from shock that they're kind of taking away some of the more wholesome aspects of the Hippocratic oath to be more kind of state-oriented, taking away kind of the personal contract we have with the patient. Anyway, but there are professional classes in a sense that have an oath, and I think this borrows from the clerisy and styles after it. And when you take an oath, you have a different bond. I'm not sure writers have that or journalists, or whether they should. When I remember reading, young about these guilds and the Hanseatic League and so forth, and I couldn't really wrap my head around it. I wasn't really much of a history. I was a science guy. I didn't really care about the history stuff that much. But now I see what guilds are. Guilds oftentimes gild their own palms, and it's kind of a punish way. But they are, and they might also be gelded as they do it. But they're grouped together to form these groups, and the groups seem to be kind of in a rent-seeking way, self-referential and self-preferential. So let's see if I can pull out a question out of that. Let's just. I guess the question is about oaths. Do writers have an oath, and if so, to what? And can they actually have a treason of the experts and treason of the intellectuals if they don't have any standards to begin with? And then we can secondarily go to the group that does, the physicians. And you have the treason of the healers as a special, chapter within your book. So maybe you could talk about that. And so what is a treason if you don't have an original obligation?
It's a great question. Although if you accept that the writer, the archetype for a writer is the philosopher, which really it is, if you go back into Western history, a lover of truth, a lover of wisdom. So everything that we have as people ensconced in mind work, if you want to call us that, is derived from the idea that we're supposedly lovers of wisdom. And I think wisdom and truth in the classical sense have a lot of overlap between them. So no, there's not an oath. I don't think you could ever enforce one. But if you look at the development of our university system, and people want to forget this today, and I'm not saying we need to go back to it either, it comes out in the Western context out of a Christian background for the most part. Although the great contributions were made, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, which I've studied, by by Islam and Judaism as well within that context. But the university comes out in the European and I think American context, it's safe to say, out of a Christian context, and you have to think that there's truth seeking at the core of it. But explicit oaths, no. I guess it then becomes a question of personal resolve. How seriously do you take that question vis-a-vis your desire to be ambitious and loved by everybody? Because inevitably in life that becomes one of the key elements. And it gets to your talking about guilds. Guilds on one hand are advertised as something that protects the integrity, the moral and intellectual integrity of a group and their skill set, right? That's the idea, and it's a beautiful idea, right? We will police ourselves. But what happens when the leadership of the guild loses sight of the moral directives and the guild then becomes a coercive practice designed to install controlling practices, to go back to Laura Nader, right? Designed to create thinkable parameters of thinkable thought that have nothing to do with what the guild was originally designed to protect. And to me, that's happening in the university. And I'll get to your issue of medicine. I think it's happening in the medical profession as well. And the medical profession, as you might have seen in the book, is something that, even though I'm not a doctor, it's a big part of my life because I'm the son, grandson, brother, quadruple cousin, triple nephew of doctors, which is to say I grew up around MDs my whole life. And to see what is happening to the medical profession in this moment, and to see what it appears to me that COVID was designed to do, which was to gut the personal relationship, be one of the many things COVID was designed to do, if we take it in those terms, was designed to gut the relationship between a doctor as one individual and a patient as another individual, and to impose upon that doctor, with his acquiescence, sadly, an ability of outside powers to say how that patient should be treated. To me, that is a tremendous treason against the dignity of the doctor, his profession, and the dignity of that patient. It basically says that people, many of whom have very untoward goals, have arrogated to themselves the right to control that relationship, and ultimately to control the body of many millions of people. That's a frightening turn of events. And as you'll see in the book, I'm very harshly critical of the medical profession that I grew up around my whole life. And I don't think the people in your profession, to personalize it, Dr. Bach, have any idea of how much they've sold themselves out in these last 3 years. And I don't think they have any idea yet as to how much lack of trust they've sown among the general population. And the fact that they're so obtuse and unwilling to look at the things that they've been party to is, well, frightening is the only word I can come back to. It's absolutely frightening, and it makes me wonder. And I'll get personal here. I happen to be the son of a wonderfully humanistic doctor. Dinner table conversation was filled with stories, a little bit about physicianing, but mostly about the human beings that pass, all anonymized, of course, but that passed through his office. And for my father, every person that came in to have their heart issues looked at was really a study that he needed to know about in the fullest possible sense.
Yeah, it's one of
and
the great.
I grew up with that as just what being a physician was about. And to see what's happening is just so disappointing.
I appreciate that. I echo that. You know, my heritage is mostly attorneys. You know, my father's an attorney, my brother's an attorney, my other brother went to law school. I've got a brother-in-law, etc. but I survived that. There's the old joke, it's only 99% of lawyers that give the other ones a bad name. But most of mine seem to have been on the 1%. There's another joke. A guy goes into a party, he's young, a bunch of single people there, and he is also, and he finds the most beautiful girl there right away. He says, I don't have much time right now. I'm wealthy, I'm Elon Musk's, co-founder, and I would give you $100,000 in cash to spend the night with me tonight. Would you? She's like, looks at me, seems acceptable. Says, yeah, I probably would. Says, well, you know what? That's all a lie. But I do have to leave. How about $30 and you and I go out tonight, right now? She's like, well, what do you think I am? I said, well, we've already established that. Now it's just a matter of price. And so I think when people, once you cross the line, then it's just a matter of price. I think that people are excellent at explaining away some of their misdeeds. We see this right now with all kinds of. It's funny, philosophy. We see it with sophistry, which is the same root word. It kind of turn on its head. But there's all kinds of sophistry that people won't look at the root cause of things, or if they see something they attribute it, they do ad hominem. They basically say, this can't be good because you are in line with this politician I hate. People can't see and think and feel. So here we are in the hands of an Iberian language specialist, to give us moral compass. But there seems to be some moral compass missing. That I can make up maybe a Spoonerism here. I'm just thinking of this. Without moral compass, you have non-compass mentis. You basically have people not. That's my first one on that one. I got to remember that one. You have people somewhat off. They think they can do it themselves. They think they can manage the whole thing, but they can't. So a question comes up. Where does God figure into this? I don't want to make your book about that per se, nor these discussions. I grew up pretty secular upbringing and whatnot, but on some level there has to be kind of the morality of what people are doing, because otherwise they seem to be only subservient to this greater good concept, which I think they have mistaken as some type of greater good.
I think you're on to one of the one of the themes that runs through the book, one that certainly concerns me, and believe it or not, it has a connection when I was talking about nationalism. I think people seek transcendence, and that's the term I like to use. In other words, we like to think of something beyond the immediate that we are in some way attached to. We often call that God. I have no need for people to call it God. I grew up in a fairly secular world, albeit within a religious tradition, but I always consider myself a highly secular person. But I was always impressed by the need and the yearning in myself and in the people I was attracted to be in touch with something greater, something awesome, something that induces awe. I mean, that could be nature. Another one of the things I always talk about is wonder. Where's the wonder in our world? There seems to be assumption that, and this goes back to the rationalist revolution of that we're living at the end of, I think, the idea that humanity was going to figure it all out, and that it was only a matter of time, which to me is such a prideful and hubristic view. No, we're going to figure some things out, but there'll always be many, many things that we won't be able to figure out. And if you look into the people that are doing the modeling now, talking about transhumanism, they're basically saying, no, this is it. We're in command, and it's only a matter of time before we'll figure it out. And that's why you have to listen to us. And I know too much history to know that almost always goes wrong. Plans of small-minded men, and we're all small-minded in our way, will always go wrong. We do not have the abilities to see the big picture that we think we have, which is why I'm very much a believer in the seeking of the transcendent and encouraging young people to find where they're seeking the transcendent in themselves. What we now have is a situation where we're bombarding young people from the very early days with so much stimuli, so localized, and so constant that we don't give them time to ponder how beautiful the trees are, how amazing it is that I'm floating on a rock going through the infinity of the universe. That sort of stuff that when you were a kid, you'd sit and look at the stars, and if you really began to think about it, your mind would start to blow about where I am and how vast the whole thing is. That's very important stuff. So it doesn't have to be religion per se. And what's killing that? I would argue that what's killing it is consumerism. The idea that everything is transactional. That really, Randy, what it's all about is me giving you something and me getting something back in return. And that life is just the sum of various transactions that I make, both monetary and otherwise, with other people. And when you were raised in that realm, you think that's what life is about. And maybe for the first time in human history, a plurality of the people in the society really think that that's what life is about. Okay. So then you come to something like COVID, you apply a little pressure to them, and they say, well, what's the best thing for my transactional self? Since there's nothing transcendent, since there's no moral order that I've either divined or imagined or hoped for, it's all about, let's see, do I want trouble or do I not? Do I want the bonus that goes with vaccinating more people or do I not? Do I want to be on good terms with my colleagues or do I not? And on and on and on and on. Those are all transactionally posed questions. And unfortunately, the medical profession, in my view, and many other guilds failed because they basically said, and the super powerful came and said, here are the incentives. And the well-trained, upwardly mobile said, okay, I'll do anything where the incentives take me because that's what life's about. Yeah. And that's where we've gotten to where we are. Your profession and my profession.
Yeah. We were both at the Brownstone meeting in Dallas, and I'm hugely impressed by Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, and I don't think it's a secret that he's an active Christian. There are other physicians as well who or not, and who have been equally brave or as brave, whatever. But it seems that you have to serve somebody. You're going to serve. I think there's a folk song to this effect, but we're all going to serve somebody. And religion, as kind of as Nietzschean might find outmoded and dead. It seems to have a framework of timeless structure and epiphanies that work for the human condition. I've have a reasonable lifetime of seeing patients and whatever, and I kind of have a framework from which I can see and think about patients and what might come out. The Bible and a lot of other of its ancillary tomes seem to be kind of a diffuse mapping of the same problems. And I have far more sympathy with kind of the workings of the ancient world, which I never did before. When I grew up, we had, the telephone, we had automobiles and whatnot. And it seemed like so far distant that those guys, wearing togas or, barely, able to kind of weave fabric would have the same dilemmas. But essentially they do. And it comes down, I think, to the needs of a person versus the applied needs of the rulers. I don't, there's not a question there. I'm going to let kind of sit that in your lap. And if you want to answer that, you can. Not really answer, but comment on that. And then I'd kind of like to move on to some of the applications of governmental power through the 20th century into the current.
Yeah, your first point about, and I don't think we should be at all bashful about saying it, many of the people who best responded to the pressure waged on us, the bombardment campaign, the public pedagogy campaign from on high, to put it in theoretical terms, who best responded were people of faith. And that's no accident, because these are people that, for better and for worse, and whatever their faith tradition might be, are working on two planes, at least mentally, right? They're saying, I'm living in the transactional world. I participate in it. I buy things at the store. I earn money. But as I do so, I'm always have another eye on what might be beyond this and some big mysteries. And I'm very glad, and I've had a renewed appreciation for the fact that I had a religious upbringing, not a terribly one. You know, we went and we did the usual things of my faith group, but I had a basis in scripture of the New Testament, and I go back to those readings, and I see at my present age this incredible wisdom in some of them. I mean, I was in Italy this past Holy Week, you know, the week leading up to Easter, and went to Mass in Italian and listened to the Passion. I mean, you listen to the Passion, all of the human dilemmas are there in about 10 pages of what was going on. Betrayal. How do you deal with betrayal? What is an accusation? How do you deal with an accusation? Should you fight? Should you keep your sword in your sheath? All of those things that are, if you've lived enough time in life, you realize are relevant to how you have to navigate in life. So there's great lessons there. And one doesn't have to necessarily see them as divinely inspired. You can see them as great stories if you want, depending on the particular way you want to approach that text. But I think you touch on another thing that I think in one of the essays I speak of, which is the notion of linear progress. Like you, I always thought we as Americans of a certain generation, we're brought up to think that time is linear. As the further you go on that timeline, the better things get. And you can look back and see how primitive, both technically and morally, were the people behind you. And you can anticipate how much more morally superior and technically superior the people will be on the timeline in front of you. Which led me at a certain point in my life, again, it came up in my studies about nationalism, you find out that linear time is a construct that is relatively new and that goes along with the scientific revolution. So it gives a parameter or a way of looking at the world that says we're inexorably getting better as human beings. And I've come through these last 3 or 4 years to be much more sympathetic to circular or spiral notions of time that were really the dominant way of looking at time in many, many traditional cultures up until the Industrial Revolution. And it begs questions about, have we advanced morally? Maybe not. Have all the dilemmas become new? Maybe not. Are we getting better in every way, or even if it's incrementally? Maybe not. And I think that's very important to realize that we live within paradigms like time, like linear time, that we're not always aware of living in it, that it's a construct that we seldom question. I used to do it with my students. Have you ever thought about the way time is constructed? They go, what do you mean? Time is time. I don't know. Time is constructed. It's a cultural construct. Do you see it linearly, or do you see it circularly? Or do you see it in some other way? And they would look at me, huh? And then I would point out how in, for example, the Basque tradition previous to 1850, and even in the literature of the nationalists there, it was a circular notion of time, meaning we need to always keep tradition as part of our contemplation of the past because we're always going to go back around. So we can't get too carried away with how much we're progressing. And I think without becoming a reactionary and saying there is no such thing as progress, maybe we are less progressing than we think.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I had this, just as you were talking about time, I had this tiny insight that Chinese apparently just has the present tense for verbs. They don't have a past tense. And so when you hear people, you know, kind of relatively recent Chinese immigrants talking to you, you know, it kind of somewhat makes more understandable, not necessarily their speech, but the framework by which they are talking, because they're saying this, that, you know, this is this, so forth. And a lot of times you're missing when it happened. But I'm not sure how that changes the way they approach events or their day-to-day and so forth. But it is, you know, it's not strictly speaking changing time, but it is changing the way you talk about it and consider it. But you know, I kind of want to segue to maybe. I mean, we'll maybe come back to some more of the topics of the treason of the experts. which I think is almost inarguable that it happened. But since I have an Iberian scholar on the other side of this call, and I know, I think your proclivities probably are more with the nationalists than the Republicans or the Francoists. I'm not sure what they were called. The nationalists versus the Republicans. I guess the revolutionaries, or whatever you want to call them, the Republicans, and the other were the nationalists. But anyway, the Francos versus the not. I don't know if you're familiar with Jean Kirkpatrick's totalitarian versus authoritarian argument. That basically both of these regimes are bad, but one has the totality. One is authoritarian. So Franco and Salazar, authoritarian. Okay, Allende, in Chile, authoritarian. Bad. We'll say those are bad regimes. You don't want to live there. But Castro, Kim, whichever Kim we're talking about in North Korea, totalitarian. They take the totality. They don't allow the church to be there. And in the Spanish Revolution, we don't get to see, or the war, we don't get to see the end result. But they were allied with the Soviets, and the Soviets, no church, no real church. The old people can go, but there's no real, doctrine allowed. The break in the Soviet Union, arguably, was through the triumvirate of Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope JP2, and Gdansk and Warsaw and the Roman Catholic Church. It seems to me the egress from bad regimes happens if and only if there seems to if there's a pillar of the church, and so did the church abdicate? I suppose we could bring it to COVID. Did the church abdicate by allowing it to be subservient to quote unquote public health without considering spiritual health? What happens now as people leave the church? I think partially because of those failings. And if you want to touch on the Spanish Civil War, go ahead.
So many thoughts going through my head. First of all, you thought I would be sympathetic to which side?
Not the Francos.
Yeah, generally speaking, the Republic. And the Republic, as you mentioned, did receive help from the Soviet Union. But that help from the Soviet Union came relatively late in the process. And it's really the Republic previous to 1936, when the war broke out, that you have to look at to see what the Republic was about. Because once they were in war, then all the foreign powers got involved, Mussolini and Hitler on one side, and the Soviets on the other. But I'm also very critical of the Republic as well. So if you really want to deal in complexities, you never are going to get blacks and whites. I mean, Franco was a brutal guy in what he did wherever he went in. I have a good friend who studied his terror and what he would do when he took over a part of Spain. He'd get the priests oftentimes to tell him who were the Reds and line them up outside the drainage ditches on the road and shoot them one by one and leave them in the ditch as a reminder to everyone else. But it's also true, the anarchists burned a lot of churches. The anarchists shot a lot of priests. The anarchists, had thugs who became anarchists and took over factories and shot the owners, even as the owners were trying to work with them. So it was an ugly scene. But now the question of egress or escape from authoritarianism. And you ask, that Jean Kirkpatrick idea that from an authoritarian regime, you can transition better to a quote unquote democratic regime is one I'm very familiar with. And I've had various thoughts on it over the years. And I just happened to have spent some time in Chile not long ago. And I've also spent a lot of time in Argentina as well. And one of the things while in Chile, I had to open my mind to was that for all of the bloodiness of Pinochet, and he was bloody, and what he did was horrendous, Chile is now in a better place economically and perhaps socially, I'm not sure, than Argentina, which had a great, well, they both did. They both had looked into their pasts. But one allied themselves with international capital, the other did not as much. My point being, I had to ask the question, which I still haven't resolved. Is Chile relatively better economically because authoritarianism of the type of Pinochet lends itself to a better transition? Or is it because a government of Chile like Pinochet's, which opened itself to international capital, gets treated nicer by international capital when they come out of the dictatorship? And so I have no firm answer, but I think it's a little bit of both. But I think probably I'm weighted to the second one, where if international capital likes what they've seen in terms of authoritarianism, they're more likely to help you out when you're coming out of the dictatorship. When international capital sees that you haven't been as clean with them, they're not going to treat you as nicely, and maybe that
kind of like your credit score. But I think I appreciate the example, and I like the insight. I've had a separate podcast with a professor from Venezuela, and we've focused on that as well as other countries and so forth. But I think a more reasonable example might be current day Venezuela. There's the joke in Venezuela. What I mean, you could use it in North Korea as well. But the joke is, what did they use before candles? Electricity. Whether Venezuela, which has an opposition candidate who's been made illegal, and whether Cuba, which I don't think ever has an opposition candidate, whether they can get out. They haven't. And, obviously Venezuela not as long as Cuba, but, Cuba stayed as long because of Venezuela, because Chavez, kind of taking his own national funds and pouring it into Cuba. So Argentina, may have its exit, and they've had sort of some mild exits beforehand because they had a democratic process. So they had Menem and Macri and now Milei. Maybe it's something about the letter M. I don't know. But Cuba doesn't get that option. Venezuela doesn't appear to get that option. So I think it's kind of like, it's almost like Hamas, which in Spanish means never. It's like, one man, one vote, one time. You vote for Hamas, and if in fact it was a good election, who knows? But that's it. You get it and you have it. H.L. Mencken said that democracy is the principle by people will vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. And I think some places, they get that good and hard even without the democracy part.
I'm not so sure we're going to agree on this. I've spent a bit of time in Cuba as well. I lectured at the University of Havana, and then spent some time crisscrossing Cuba and speaking to people. And when you're in their taxi, no one's listening to you, so people speak. And Cubans are pretty free despite it all. I've also run into when cops are around, and it's not pretty. So I'm not going to whitewash the Cuban regime. But what's funny when you talk to Cubans a lot is they say, we're very proud of the revolution. The revolution gave us a dignity that we never would have had, and a sense of independence we never had. But the economy's terrible. And we admit the economy's terrible. And if only you could fix the economy, we'd be very happy with the revolution. Which again begs the question, had Cuba not been embargoed by the United States, might it have been able to evolve into a mixed economy? With the embargo, it never really had the opportunity to evolve into a mixed economy, because that also happens. So China opened up, right? And it's a booming economy that's really an odd mixture. So it's hard to come, I think, to hard and fast conclusions about these things.
Fair enough. So let's see if we can kind of circle back to COVID on this, and maybe we can use the as a wedge the freedom aspect. People pretty much leave Cuba if they can. I'm not sure how many emigres there are lapping up onto the shores of Cuba versus the converse.
No, clearly.
And I'm wondering, during New Zealand's era, whether people would rather come or go if they can. And so let's talk about the freedom axis, which I think is independent of COVID tests and whatnot. Mark Changizi, I've had on the show 3 times. He thinks whatever you thought about COVID, you had no right to take away freedoms. And so this becomes kind of an interesting concept. What is freedom? Is it personal freedom, group freedom? Does my freedom, my ability to swing my arms end at your nose? And, does my ability to forbid or forego a vaccine end with your, presumptions that if I don't get one, you're going to die. How did this play out? What were the rationalities, and where are we left now with potential mandates and or quarantine cities or whatever? I mean, how on a scale of 0 to the People's Republic of China, where are we and where are we headed?
A couple of things come to mind. First is what happened to the supposed idealization of freedom in our culture, and why were people so ready to give it up? But the second that comes to mind is garbage in, garbage out. The entire vaccine argument was based on fundamental lies. And the fundamental lie was that these vaccines were designed and proven to stop transmission. That's the thinnest reed. That's the only reed upon which you could make an embracing social argument for obligatory vaccines. Maybe the other one would be that this scourge was so brutal that millions of people would be dying. Both of these things were made crystal clear by the end of 2020, if not before. The Diamond Princess showed us what the infection fatality rate was likely to be with this. Jay Bhattacharya's studies on a couple of California counties did so as well, if I'm not mistaken, in the spring of 2020. Mm-hmm. John Ioannidis' studies also showed and gave what has now become a perfect prophecy of what the IFR was. All of this was known. And why wasn't it transmitted? Because there was a culture planning effort on behalf of very powerful people to keep it out of the eyes of most human beings. But let's go back to the vaccines. First thing I did, and I wrote an article about this, was look at the FDA briefing papers on the vaccines. This was, the first ones came out in December of 2020. The second two came out in January of 2021. Go into the briefing papers. Known capacities of vaccines, unknown capacities. And it said very clearly, no information about their ability to stop transmission or infection. So, idiot humanities professor reads FDA briefing papers. Apparently no one else was reading FDA briefing papers. And I said, well, you just told me what the possibilities are for this to do that, and you have no idea that they will do either of these things. And yet an entire propaganda campaign was mounted on the very premise that this was the case and that my vaccine taking had remotely something to do with you. It had nothing to do with you. It had nothing to do with any other person in the world. And as we saw, the vaccines did or failed to do exactly what we knew they were meant to fail to do. And this is the thing that to these days, you can see I'm still angry about it. The idiocy of this propaganda and the discourse overwhelming what was there in black and white from the very beginning. And I would have the experience of showing these briefing papers and say, go to page 52 and Don, and people would say, yeah. But are you going to get it? Are you going to protect your grandmother? Are you going? And I would say, did you just read what I just read? And they go, are you going to get it? Are you going to protect other people? And, and you just go, okay. So you are, with your, I'm thinking of one person with your Princeton degree, you are listening to the garbage in. You have no idea.
Yep, absolutely.
You have no desire to find out whether it's garbage or not. You accept it as good stuff, and you're taking a huge step for your body, and you're becoming aggressive and hurtful to other people on the basis of something that has no empirical foundation. I mean, the other person that was very important for me was Sushari Bhakti, marvelous German immunologist, who said, these things are going to wreak havoc with the epithelium of people. It's going to be all sorts of circulation problems, all sorts of embolistic problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the guy knew what he was talking about, predicted it all. He was shut out. He was threatened with legal action. And so the discourse lived on, and the quote unquote smart people not only had who should have been the ones to ask basic questions, failed to ask them, and then became the enforcers.
Yeah, it was Orwellian. I have a number of mistakes. First of all, by the time the vaccine was there, the actual SARS-CoV-2 had disappeared, ancestral had gone. So if they, when they did monoclonal antibodies, if you had a severe case of alpha, beta, delta, they had monoclonal antibody to alpha, beta, or delta. And the monoclonals they had for the ancestral, they didn't use. If you had one for A, you wouldn't use it for B or C. If you had one for C, you wouldn't use. Anyway, so they were all very specific, but the vaccine somehow was only the ancestral version. They didn't update that the way they would for monoclonal antibodies. So there's no internal logic there. Getting back to Orwell, if you looked at Wikipedia, they changed the definitions of what a vaccine was. Vaccine had always been prior to an illness, you vaccinate. So people ask me, I was at Steve Kirsch's event at MIT last week, and I quasi, sort of debated him because he's against all vaccines at this point, and I'm not. I've had my share of, I've had dozens of flu shots. I think, we don't see rubella anymore. We don't see polio. We don't see smallpox. I think vaccines have had some good roles, and you can't point to the huge number of vaccine injuries now without comparing to the lack of them for decades prior. So I think they, fairly quiet. I mean, there's an autism argument, all that kind of stuff. I think maybe we should reopen and how we give vaccines and whatnot. But anyway, insofar as we gave them, we always gave them prior to a problem. And we would certainly never give them after somebody had the illness. I have my Dr. Fauci voice. I trot out in 2005. He was asked, should you get, I think it was avian flu or something like that. Should you get this year's flu shot if you already had the avian flu? He's like, why would you do that? You've already had the illness. You've had perfect immunity already. And how this man saying that could come up, 16, 17 years later, whatever the number, 15 years later, and say precisely the opposite means you're like that woman at the party. You've been purchased. And the only question is how much and for what, whether it was lucre or your name recognition or what. I think, there's an old expression that Washington is Hollywood for ugly people. And I'm not sure what version, bureaucracy is versus that. But I think people get their moment of fame and they like to be in the spotlight. And this is, kind of one of these human foibles that, is biblical and everything else and whatnot. Anyway, I would like to preserve your moment of fame. So I'm going to give you a chance for some closing words, and I'm going to tell people where they can buy your book.
There was a lot to what you just said. I guess it gets to a number of questions for me. One of which is, then why? Now there's money, but I think it has to be more than money. Debbie Lerman, our colleague at Brownstone, has done some wonderful investigative work on who was really calling the shots. And it was the intelligence community that was calling the shots on a lot of this stuff. And I have never been one who wanted to think that there are people that want to mess with us massively with our bodies. But when you do listen to some of the things that are talked about in the realm of the hackable human being in the future, these things that are talked about in the realm of what is sometimes called transhumanism, and you look at the mRNA platform, I have to think that the fervor to get people accustomed to having the mRNA injections has a lot to do with the belief that the mRNA platform, which we will perfect after carrying out this billion-person lab, they will perfect after carrying out this billion-person lab experiment, that they don't really care. I think the idea is to have hackable human beings. I can't think there's the fervor on just from a greed point of view doesn't add up. I mean, these people got all they wanted, but then they could have gotten it with a lot less.
Yep.
But putting it into children,
Yep.
putting it into everybody, making sure it's there, this had to be about the platform. And if you look at what's going on now with all of the limited hangouts, they're basically saying, well, it didn't work, no big deal. But they now have the platform. They have an enormous amount of information that they can use. They now know that a good percentage of the population, if riled up enough by propaganda, will allow their body's genetic makeup to be messed around with. And I think from an incremental sense, that's the way they think. They think this isn't going to happen overnight. But we had a hugely important first night of the show. We got 70% of the people to put this stuff in their bodies on a completely false basis.
Yep.
And I have to think from their point of view, they're very encouraged with their ability to do that. They're going to try and lie their way out of all of the deaths and injuries that we now know are happening. They're going to wait for time to pass, and they're going to come back with the next hysteria and do it again. And for a lot of people who can't think their way through these things, they're going to do it again.
Yeah. There's an old joke about a blind date. I'm sorry for all the jokes. So there's a blind, somebody knows both a masochist and a sadist and thinks, oh my God, these two people would be perfect together. Masochist loves receiving pain, sadist loves anyway. So they get them together and they're on a date and things progress for a little bit. And finally they're I don't know whose house they're at. And the masochist, kind of had a few drinks and says, to the sadist, hurt me. And the sadist says, no. Anyway, we're at this stage where things are being done. Andrew Clavin was one of my guiding lights, I guess. Brings out that absent a God, sadism, is a reasonable philosophy. Sod, sees his own pleasure, his own, kind of selfish, I guess, self as the solipsism as the guiding principle. And if he's having fun, then why not? And the reason why not is the golden rule. And treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself. But if you're not into that, then who cares? And we kind of see a fair amount of that where power predominates, and this kind of bowing to power. I had I made on Twitter. I put up a little cartoon, whatnot. Kind of a guy with a scimitar over at a college campus, and basically he's referring to the University of Pennsylvania. Basically, I said the sword is mightier than the pen. In this case, university. That people are basically bowing to power because they don't have that external framework. They don't have that other framework. But just I'd like to kind of get back to your book here. And one other thing before I do, I'm going to pop up. This is a mild segue to your hacking instance. This is from 2017. My expertise is the Zika vaccine, Zika virus. But back in 2017, I came upon this. That Bill and Melinda Gates wanted to place bets, $100 million on this biotech. Now, this biotech means and they're giving the money to Moderna for it's right here. They want to give money to Moderna Therapeutics up to $100 million to develop mRNA vaccines, quote unquote, for infectious diseases. But I think it's this hackable self kind of thing. So they were on this, they didn't come up with a Zika vaccine. Zika microcephaly as a concept disappeared. And that's the essence of my book, but the rationale behind it, what happened. But they've been on this for a while. This is 2017. So even before COVID came along, they wanted the mRNA, mRNA. They want that thing. And I think you're making a very reasonable point. I'm not sure what Chomsky's thinkable thoughts actually means, but this is certainly a thought that they're thinking. Quite a bit.
Well, they're establishing, they want to put hackability, to put it into Chomsky, they want to put hackability of the body into the field of thinkable thought.
Yep.
And I think they took a big step forward to getting the hackability of the human body from other people into the field of thinkable thought. Why not? You can have better set of breasts, you can have why not? Why stop there? And there just happens to be a huge a platform that can allow you to get what you want, which of course goes in the face of the inherent wonder of each human being as they're born into the world,
Yeah.
Among other things.
So I'm going to leave with the words of the philosopher Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you want. You can try sometime. You just might find you get what you need. Anyway, so here's your book, The Treason of the Experts. People can buy it, and it's I'm reading it right now. I've not read every single word in it, Some of them are too long for me to comprehend. Just kidding. But it's a fabulous book.
Don't
Great
say
book.
that.
No, they're great. It's great. I love it, and I'm going to try to follow up with some of your references as well. So I'm really happy about my purchase. I'm happy about your inscription. Actually, I'm going to actually read it for my audience because whether you meant it or not is another question. But for Randy, one of the good guys in the profession that has lost its way. So I'm honored by that. Thank you so much. And if people want to help support my podcast, they can buy my book, which is no match for yours, but it is an interesting look into the world of pandemics. So Zika, the pandemic that never was. Oh, excuse me, overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. And that's a whole story in and of itself. It's a fascinating story because, again, fortunately, we're both sitting down, but you'll be shocked to know that there was not all the science they pretended and portended there was. There were no Zika tests in Brazil at all, none in the world at the time. There was no microcephaly registry. They had no way of checking their data. They had no real good case definition of what microcephaly is and isn't, and so forth. And mind you, the mosquito, you're the Spanish expert, but from my understanding, mosquitoes speak neither Spanish nor Portuguese, and yet they were able to distinguish and only bring microcephaly to northeast Brazil and not to Colombia, not to Venezuela, not to Guyana, not to Suriname. So it'd be French and Dutch and whatnot, French Guinea, whatever. So this mosquito, it only happened. Basically, it was all the underpinnings are facts of a panic and kind of a hysteria, and it has not recurred. But nobody has dropped away from the theory within within the guild of Zika research, because billions have been spent, and there's going to be a Zika vaccine around the corner. And as Bill Gates wanted it, it's most likely going to be mRNA. It's going to be foisted upon the public at large, a billion in the tropics to begin with, and then maybe everybody, and then they're going to declare victory. So I'm all for the positive victories of vaccines insofar as they're there, but you need to have the problem first. So smallpox, yes, bad thing, fine. Zika microcephaly, and Zika is a real virus. Microcephaly is a real problem. Just so happens one doesn't cause the other, and they're barking up the wrong tree, and so forth. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Last words, Professor?
Yeah, I'll just add what you just brought up, and I leave people with this. I am of the opinion that our elites have given up on governing us in a fair way, and that the only way they feel they can govern us now is through induced panics. In other words, the false flag and induced panics is not an anomaly. It's a way of functioning. They have given up on persuasion. They realize that we can think too many thoughts. They have bigger plans for us, and that creating panics, and until we begin to recognize and say no to their created panics, we're going to do it again and again and again, because this is the way. And I have an essay in the book going back to the late 60s in Europe. Italy was a key node in this. The inducement of panics is now the way our elites govern us.
Which is a sadness. So thank you so much. People should go buy your book, Treason, the experts. They'll learn and be aware, and education presumably is the our vaccine against such craze, silliness. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thanks so much.